Story 1. The Creature. My name is Luke, and I have been a truck driver since I was 22. This is the story of when I first started driving trucks. The company I used to drive for only gave me routes that were inside the states. I usually didn't have to drive for long, cause the routes were short. One day I got a route that was slightly longer than I used to drive, and I hadn't driven on that route before. I looked at the map and saw that there was another route that was a shortcut. I asked one of my senior colleagues why they gave me the longer one when it had a much shorter route as well. He told me that this route is mostly covered in thick forest, and there is also an urban legend about that place. He whispered, people claimed to have heard weird noises coming from the forest, sounds that weren't of any known animal. I laughed and said hysterically, "Are you trying to scare me? Because if you are, it won't work on me." But he looked at me with a serious face and told me to not go through that route. I agreed. I took off the next day, and while driving I thought of what my coworker said, but being a confident and smug young man, I decided to take the shorter route. I wanted to show him that I wasn't scared of his little story. While driving, I didn't notice anything unusual other than the dense forest. There were hardly any cars, and when night fell, the roads were almost empty. This route was far from civilization, and I could barely see any truck stops, just woods on either side of the road. I didn't have any coffee with me, and I was starting to get a little drowsy. I tried to keep myself awake. There were several occasions when I almost fell asleep, and I felt the truck drifting off to the side of the road. I decided to stop for a while. I parked the truck at the side of the road and got out to get some fresh air. I splashed my face with some water to regain consciousness, and just as I was done, I heard a man scream from a distance. It was coming from inside the woods. I wasn't scared. I thought it was probably a hiker who got badly injured and needed help. Many hikers get caught up in bear traps set up by people living in rural areas. I grabbed my flashlight from the truck and stupidly decided to check on him. After a minute or so, there was another scream. This time it sounded like he was in pain. The screaming continued as I rushed towards the source, then suddenly the scream stopped, but I almost reached to the point from where I heard the screaming. I heard the rustling of bushes and twigs. I heard growling and chewing noises. At first I thought it was a bear, but that's not what it was. I shone my flashlight in that direction, and I saw a thin, hairy, and almost 8-foot-tall creature. It stopped eating and looked at me with its blood-stained eyes. It had sharp teeth that was covered in blood. I looked to its side and saw a man lying lifeless with one of his limbs torn apart. Those were the screams of that man who was being eaten alive. The creature stood up and let out a penetrating howl. This scene was enough for me to understand that I had to get out of there. Not caring if the branches hit me, I started sprinting off towards my truck. I was covered in cold sweat, and my fingers and legs were shaking uncontrollably. I somehow reached my truck, started the engine, and got out of there. I looked through the rear-view mirror, and luckily it didn't follow me. I didn't stop after that. I was now wide awake, and my heart was still racing. My fingers were cold, and my legs were shaking. After driving continuously for 3 hours straight, I saw a truck stop and parked my truck. I just sat inside trying to compose myself. I still couldn't believe what I saw. I still didn't know if what I saw was real or just my hallucination. And was my mind just playing games with me? I just knew I was never going to take that route again. I am now 33 years old, and it has been years since that incident. Now I don't get out of my truck to help anyone in need in the middle of nowhere. It might sound a bit selfish, but ever since that incident, I have been very careful with my decisions. 2. This is the story my father told me recently, and it happened when he used to drive trucks when I was just a newborn. He only drove in our home state of Texas, and summers were extremely busy for him. This incident happened during the mid-90s on one of his extended trips across Texas. On one such trip, he was driving to the south of the state. He was getting tired, so he pulled his rig into the parking lot of a truck stop. He was making his way to the on-site convenience store when he noticed a young woman pacing back and forth in front of the shop. She looked to be in her early 20s, slim, very pretty, blonde, and wearing a tank top with cut-off shorts, normal attire for Texas summers. He came out of the store and made his way back to the truck. As he got in, he was shocked to see that the blonde woman was now sitting in his passenger seat. He was utterly shocked. He had no clue who this woman was or how she got in as the doors were locked. My dad was very careful on the road and never left his truck unlocked. He demanded her to get out of his truck. He wasn't afraid of her. But something felt off about this mysterious woman. She just sat there and stared at the road, not saying a word. For a moment he wondered if he should just get out, but he thought maybe she needed help. My dad took out his cell phone to call the cops, but surprisingly there was no reception. He asked her if she wanted a ride, but she didn't respond. He told her that he was heading south, so if that's where she wanted to go, then he can take her along the way. So my dad, against his better judgment, turned his rig on and drove off with the blonde woman still sitting in his passenger seat. A few miles up the road, he attempted to start up a conversation to break the silence. He asked for her name, but again, the woman remained silent. He thought she was deaf and mute, so he tapped her shoulder to gain her attention. As soon as he touched her, the blonde woman turned her face towards him, and her gorgeous face turned into some kind of a hellish monster. Her face turned rugged, and her eyes were now black pits. Her teeth had turned into sharp fangs with a long, unnatural-looking tongue. The demonic figure let out a guttural hiss. She held his hand and slowly came closer. My dad turned his face away from her as she stretched her tongue and licked his face. He got goosebumps and his heart was beating so fast, but he still kept one of his eyes on the road as he was still driving. He managed to bring his rig to a stop on the side of the road. As the truck came to a halt, my dad quickly opened the door and jumped out of his truck. His legs were shaking uncontrollably, and he crawled to a distance to get away from that thing. After taking a few moments to compose himself and allow his breathing to return to normal, he looked back at his truck. The demonic woman had vanished, and he was now alone on the road. He started to pray in the middle of the road, asking God to rebuke the evil spirit. After roaming a while by the side of the road to clear his head and get some air, he went back inside his truck and drove off. The next day, he recounted everything that happened to my mom. She didn't believe him and told him that maybe he was hallucinating, as he had been working continuously for weeks without getting proper rest. But he was sure that what he encountered was not just his imagination. 2 years after the incident, he quit his job as a truck driver. He had seen a lot in his life, but nothing had ever frightened him like that before. I got chills while he narrated the story to me. I currently work as a truck driver and hope to never have to encounter something like that in my life. Story 3. I have been a trucker since my mid-20s, and I have had many odd experiences on the road and encountered many strange drivers at times. However, the encounter I'm going to share today is by far the most terrifying and strange experience I have ever had. This happened on a country road in the middle of Kansas when I was 32. The year was 2010. The night started off like most nights, which consisted of me driving and listening to some music on the radio, usually drinking some coffee to keep myself from getting too tired. As I drove through the night on the empty road, I noticed that it began to get foggy. This fog eventually became very thick, and I started thinking to myself whether I should pull over for a while, as I could barely see ahead or keep driving. I thought about it and decided to continue on. There were 0 other people so far out driving in the middle of the country, so maybe it was safer than I thought. I still took precautions. I was going slowly just in case an animal or something were to run across the road. As I continued driving, I started to pick up an odor. This odor was the foulest thing I have ever smelled, and it soon filled the inside of my truck. I quickly closed the window, but it didn't help. This terrible smell was already inside, and I felt as if I was going to vomit. The smell and the fog became overwhelming. I remember thinking to myself, what in the world could be causing such an awful stench? At that same moment, I felt that unpleasant feeling when you know you're about to throw up. I had no choice but to quickly stop the truck and open the door to empty my stomach. When I was finished, I quickly covered my face as that horrible smell was still in the air. I closed the door and prepared myself to start driving again. And that's when I noticed something ahead crossing the road. The figure was unmistakably a man, and this man appeared to be limping, other than his limping. I also noticed that the man was wearing an old white button shirt and black suspenders. I recall thinking to myself how strange and freaky the situation was, and not knowing what to do. I decided that I was going to ask if he was okay, and if I should call anyone for help. Before I was able to drive up to him, I soon noticed a few more people come out from the side of the road, all walking in the same direction as the first man. Each of them were walking in that same odd, limping way, and all of them were wearing outdated farming clothes. What I found even more strange was the fact that they didn't acknowledge the huge truck. I thought to myself, if these people needed help, they would have surely come up to me. However, all of them continued limping across the road, disappearing into the darkness and the fog. Just then, another figure emerged from the darkness and began to cross the road too. However, this figure was far smaller, and I soon realized that this was a child. I got out of my truck, but I did not go up to the kid, rather. I stared at him as he continued to cross the road. This child was also walking in a weird way and was wearing those old clothing too. Right when he was about to make it to the other side, I called out to him, "Do you need any help?" I still regret that decision. As soon as I called out, the boy stopped turning his head to face me. My heart sank all the way to my feet. As soon as I saw his face, I froze. I wasn't looking at the face of an ordinary child. I was looking at the face of a corpse. I just stood there in fear, too afraid to even move a bit. This thing then let out the most awful screech I've ever heard and began to limp towards me, but at a much quicker speed than before. I came back to my senses and quickly went back inside my truck and slammed the door shut. He came up to the front and just stood there. At that very moment, I heard even more of those horrifying screams and saw more of these things beginning to emerge from the darkness. I quickly swerved around the kid, speeding out of there as quick as I could. During this whole ordeal, I saw the faces of the other ones that were coming, and they all had a face of decomposed corpses. Once I made it back to civilization, I stopped at a gas station. I just sat there in the truck. My mind and heart were still racing and had no idea what to think. I kept thinking, what were those things? I went into the store to get some refreshments to calm my mind. I saw two people inside the store. They were also probably truckers. After getting a drink, I went up to the cashier. They were standing there and struck up a conversation. They asked me where I was from and where was I going. They came from the same route as I did, but they didn't experience anything abnormal on the way. At one point, I thought I should tell them what I saw, but then I reconsidered as I thought they wouldn't believe me and call me a bluff. I went back to my truck and the stench was gone. I continued driving and reached my destination early in the morning. Whenever I think about this incident, I get goosebumps and chills down my spine. I still drive trucks, but I haven't experienced something like that again, and I pray I never do. Story 4. I'm a truck driver, and I work for a certain water company that is located in Michigan. The route that I drive for this company takes me as far as the Upper Peninsula down to central Michigan. To give an idea of where this creepy incident took place, I was near Roscommon County. This was way back in late January, when the night would come as quickly as 5 p.m. I was driving down the rural highway around 8 p.m., and a snowstorm was picking up. As I was cruising down the highway, my truck began to sputter and shake. With a sigh, I pulled off to the side of the road, turned on my hazard lights, and put the vehicle in park. I have been dealing with this all day because of a coolant leak in the heater core. I have to fill up the coolant tank, which takes about 5 minutes or so. I got out of my truck dressed in nothing but my regular clothes. I went up to the hood, unlatched it, and pulled it up. The sound of it opening was the only sound that could be heard. It was very quiet out there at the time, except for some blowing wind. The night was overcast and very dark due to the storm. My only source of light was from the hazards on the truck and a small flashlight. There was a thick line of woods which were about 100 feet away from each side of the road. As I began to fill up the coolant tank, I heard some rustling in the bushes coming from 150 to 200 feet deeper in the woods. I thought nothing of it due to the fact that deer are very common during winter, but the strangest thing was that the rustling was quite loud. a lot louder than animals would usually be. The wind was blowing decently hard, but I could still hear the rustling very clearly. I was wondering what could be so loud. When I heard a loud crack and a soft thud, it really got my attention. It didn't seem like a deer anymore. It sounded like a person stumbling around. Humans are very loud in the woods, and no animal would purposely make a noise to attract attention to itself. For a second, I thought it might be a bear, but then again, it was a cold winter night. The real concern I had was that the last house I saw was about 10 miles away, and no cars or other vehicles had passed me by yet. And somehow there was a person walking around out there in the woods in the middle of a snowstorm. Still cautious of the guy walking around, I finished refilling the tank. These few minutes felt like a decade. I am a fairly tall man, but those noises were still giving me the creeps, to be honest. I was a bit scared, and my heart was pounding very loudly. I wanted to finish filling the tank as soon as possible and go back inside my truck. After I finished refilling the tank, I locked the hood down and quickly went inside the truck. I locked the door but kept my window down due to the fact I could still hear the guy out there. Suddenly the rumbling stopped, which put me on edge. I turned the key in the ignition. A loud beep resounded from the truck. The truck roared to life and I started to pull back onto the road to continue driving. As soon as my truck started rolling, I heard the crashing start up again, but at a much louder and quickened pace. By the sound of it, whatever it was, seemed to be making its way to the track. I thought this guy was dumb or something, but it still freaked me out, so I pushed the truck to go faster. With the hazard lights still on, I could see the outer edges of the back of the truck. And when I looked through the rearview mirror, I saw a person sprinting towards my truck. The creepy part about it was that I was traveling at about 15 miles per hour and pushing it, still climbing, and the guy was fast enough to keep up and he was closing the distance to my truck. Now, with a cold sweat, I pushed the truck into a higher gear and the engine roared louder. I was going on 25 miles per hour, and this guy almost caught up to me, but I kept going. And when I looked back again, that guy was gone. I guessed he was so focused on catching up to the truck, he didn't notice the guardrail at the side of the road and hit it. I still freaked out, but I continued to drive down the road, ignoring the speed limit, until I reached the motel I was supposed to stay in. Sitting on the bed, I kept thinking about that man. It wasn't a normal human being, I was sure of it. And then it suddenly struck me. Maybe he was making those noises on purpose to lure me in. I still wonder what would have happened to me if I didn't fill the tank on time, or if he didn't hit the rail and caught up to me. Would I still have been alive? Story 5. I have been a truck driver since I was 22, and I have done a lot of night drives and of course had my fair share of odd experiences. I did deliveries for a number of different types of companies, and often I would have to drive across states to make shipments to receiving companies or store. One day I had to drive literally from one side of California to the other to deliver a trailer full of wooden furniture for a certain company. Much of the drive was through the open desert roads. It was going to take many hours, and I already had a late start, so I knew majority of my drive would be in the dark. There were less to no traffic in these straight desert roads, so I thought to push the truck a little faster than I would on other roads. It was around 1 a.m., and I was starting to get a little drowsy. I passed a truck stop an hour ago but didn't decide to stop as the next one was not that far. It would take 45 minutes to reach the next stop from where I was. I was confident that I could make it, but my eyes were giving up. I tried to stay awake, but I kept drifting to the other side of the road. Luckily, there were no vehicles. I didn't even stop to get some coffee at the last truck stop. After about 30 minutes of driving, I could see the bridge and was a bit relieved as the truck stop was not far. As soon as I thought I was starting to regain my vision, I saw a black figure emerge from the side of the road and stood in the middle. I could tell it was a person, a woman to be specific, with long hair and a dress. I almost crashed into her, but somehow managed to get past her. I stopped the truck and was furious with her recklessness. I got out and shouted at her, but as I went to the back, she was gone. It freaked me out, but I looked around to see if she got hurt, but to no avail. I couldn't find her. I felt a sudden chill as the temperature around me dropped. I was scared now and wanted to get back inside my truck. As I got back and started my truck, My eyes peeked into the rearview mirror and I saw her standing there still. But this time I wasn't going to stop and confront her because I was already creeped out a bit. I ignored her and went my way. After crossing the bridge, I got to the truck stop and spent my night there. It was ironic how moments ago I was struggling to keep my eyes open, but now I was struggling to sleep. I was wide awake and still scared from what happened. I thought my mind was playing tricks as I was sleepy, but I have never had a hallucination this vivid. I told my colleagues about this incident, but of course they didn't believe me. I had quit being a truck driver and now work at an office in the city, but at least I have a cool story to tell people and my children about an eerie experience I encountered. I don't think of it much, but when I do, it still gives me the chills. The end. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.